Hello, everybody. Welcome to People Ops School, where I have the great honor of talking with the very people working to make work healthier, more human, and more creative. I'm really excited for today's conversation with Courtney. Courtney is someone I have learned a lot from when it comes to people ops and creating an inclusive team culture. I had the pleasure of working with and learning from Courtney at Buffer, where she most recently led the team as director of people. And in the new year, Courtney is moving to Hologram as the VP of people. I really appreciate you joining me today, Courtney.
Oh, thank you. I am elated to be here.
Yeah, awesome. Let's dive right in. We were chatting a little bit before I started hitting recording, but I have found people operations can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And so I'd love to hear what people operations means to you, Courtney.
Sure. I actually found this to be a very interesting question that I didn't have like a ready answer for. So I'm glad I had a little bit of time to think about it.
Yeah,
And I think it's sort of like so deceptively simple that I couldn't like put my finger on it right away.
right.
But what I came up with is that people ops is sort of like the mechanism by which you create a deliberate culture.
Mm,
So I see our role as people ops people as saying like, okay, like let me work with CEO and the exec team. Where do we want to go as a culture? Like, okay, we want to be experimental. Okay, then
mhm,
people ops' job is to figure out how to embed that in the team in all the different facets of the work we do, so that culture is strong and comes through in the way that that the team would want it to.
mm,
So that kind of permeates everything from like who you hire to like what the teammate experience is like, how you prioritize things like learning and development within the team, how you get together, how you communicate. Yeah, it's all about culture, which probably does not surprise you to hear me say.
No, not at all. But I think one thing that's really interesting, I liked how you described it as a mechanism, and I feel like you used some very like active, proactive verbs in there. And so I think that's an interesting piece that I might pull out slightly to get your thoughts
Mm.
on. Um, I think that there in the past has been some views around kind of like HR, people ops being a slightly reactive role. And the way that you framed it, I think felt a lot more proactive.
Oh, happy to hear that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it can be a reactive role because culture stays being creative whether or not you are part
Mm,
of it or not. So
mhm,
often, depending on where you come in with a company and a company's culture, you can be undoing things, redoing things, building on existing things. And a lot of times that is sort of reacting to the
mm,
situations that exist,
mhm.
whether it's like how people communicate or, yeah, it's usually how people communicate,
Yeah.
honestly, like conversations around that. That's kind of the big piece of it. But if you can get proactive about it, if you can all sort of agree, like we're trying to create something, we're trying to
Mhm,
create a deliberate, thoughtful culture that looks like this,
mhm.
then you can kind of there will still be moments where you react, but it's kind of like you put everyone on the same page that you're moving towards something instead of just like letting things hit you and reacting to them.
Yeah, I think that's a good maybe transition to one of the questions I had in mind. So I'm going to skip one, but I think
Okay.
I'd love to hear what you think it looks like for an organization to truly invest in people ops. And so there were some things that you mentioned in your last answer around being like deliberate and thoughtful. Maybe you could expand on that a little.
Sure. Yeah, I have been thinking about this a whole lot because, as you mentioned, I am sort of in the midst of
Yeah.
a transition, and that's one thing that was kind of the most crucial thing to me,
Mhm.
is that any company I would join would need to be very focused on people ops, like having really bought into that concept and like giving it all the space and resources that it needs. So I did a lot of like kicking the tires around that concept with
Mm,
hologram, and it didn't occur to me that that's what I was doing actually. But a lot of the questions I asked, around like how do you disagree? Like, what
mhm,
happens when people are not on the same page and like want to do things differently? How do your values manifest in the decisions you make as a company? So all those questions that I was asking, now I realize we're like,
Yeah.
how do you invest in people and people ops and culture? And have you thought about those things? Like, I think that's kind of the main element, is just to have given it thought, have given it brain space, and decided to decided to take it seriously,
Mhm.
decided to be very thoughtful about how you develop it, because it's going to happen regardless. Culture, it just happens when people
Right.
get together and communicate.
Mhm.
And if you're not deliberate and thoughtful, it can take all sorts of interesting and varied forms that you may or may not like.
Mhm.
So, yeah, to be able to give that thought and deliberation on the front end is probably the main piece of really taking it seriously and buying into it. And then other than that, it's about resources. Like,
Mhm.
are you staffing up that capacity early? Or, are you like waiting until like you're like hundreds and hundreds of people to be like, oh yeah, we probably should like think about
Mhm.
people. And that happens a whole lot. And that's not necessarily, a kiss of death, but it's probably not an organization that I would be as excited to,
Right.
to join, because it's kind of like they've shown you what their priorities are.
Mm. I think this is really interesting, and I hadn't thought about this before we started talking, but you have a unique perspective right now, having gone through the process of really like looking at a new organization and trying to evaluate how much they invest in people ops. And I think, especially for people working in people ops, um, when you're considering joining a new company, it can be kind of hard to like truly understand if the company does invest in people ops, because
Absolutely.
there can be like people can give really great answers, but how do
Yes.
you like truly know? And so I liked your examples of some questions you asked.
Thanks. Yeah, I think it's very easy to pay it lip service.
Mhm.
And at Buffer, sometimes when I was interviewing candidates, and you may have encountered this also, there a common sort of question that people would beat around the bush and try to ask in different ways was like,
Mm.
what's it really like here? Like,
Yeah.
let me peek behind the curtain. Like, what are the challenges? Like, what are the problems? Like, is it really as good as, it is portrayed to be
Mhm.
in your social media and everything that you post online? And I think that's however they got around to asking that question. I think it's a really astute
Mhm.
observation, and a really important question to figure out how to ask in some way. Because of course, every company is gonna, post pictures of people hugging and dogs and like all the stuff that you expect to see on a about page or a hiring page. But what you really want to know is like, is this a place where I can thrive? Like, are there
Mhm.
gonna be people who will be inclusive? Like, is it a spot that is gonna, like welcome me, and where I'm gonna be able to communicate in a healthy way and like achieve what I want to achieve? And those are very hard questions to ask.
Yeah.
So it's like finding some cheat codes to ask those questions
Mhm.
really helps.
Yeah. I find I haven't quite like figured this out yet, but I was helping someone think through, and as like a candidate, you're used to being asked behavioral questions, and so you're interviewing for a job and you're used to having them say like, what would it look like if this thing happened? And
Mm-hmm.
I was in conversation with someone recently, and we are talking about like, as a candidate, how do you ask the company behavioral questions? And so the kind of like one that you gave in asking like, what does it look like when your team disagrees, or like what would it look like if you disagreed about this thing?
Mm-hmm.
um,
Yeah, I think that one really helped me a whole lot.
yeah.
It turned out to be pretty illuminating. And talking about values, if the company has stated values somewhere on
Mhm.
their website, it's great to dig in on those. Like, how do those affect your decision making? How does those
Mhm.
affect the way you communicate? Yeah.
Yeah, we're kind of, I guess, talking around employer branding a little bit. And you mentioned when people would interview a buffer who has like quite a lot of transparent content
It's
about what it's like
true.
to work there. And I
It's
think
true.
you have an interesting background as like a journalist and an editor, and you're a fantastic writer. Uh,
Oh, thank you.
and I have been feeling, I have this like theory, I don't know if it's real or not, but I feel like there's an increase in interest about employer branding. And I think part of it is like a side effect of more teams working remotely and learning how important it is to document, uh, and to
Great
be
point.
explicit about process. And so for me, and this might just be a result of my background, but when I think about companies with great employer branding, I typically think of remote teams like Buffer and Zapier and Doist. Um, so where's my question in here? I think I think kind of just like have any thoughts on remote work employer branding connection, but my real question is what advice would you give someone who wants to create authentic employer branding content for their team and answer that question you posed of like, do I fit in here and will I thrive here?
Yeah. You know, I had not, until you mentioned it, connect those, like the sort of year that 2020 has been
Yeah.
in terms of like emergency remote working
Mm-hmm.
with employee branding. And I think that's really smart and makes a lot of sense to me. And I would like to tack on, um, I imagine that this sort of like Black Lives Matter
Yeah.
re-explosion of the summer probably has a lot to do with that too, because
Mm-hmm.
brands were being asked to be accountable in ways that they really hadn't
Mm-hmm.
before. So yeah, it's been like a wild year to sort of like be a values driven,
Right.
a representative of a values driven
Mm-hmm.
company. So yeah, I think those two things together, and probably some other factors of 2020, have created a moment where we don't just want to know, like what the vacation policy is and like the 401k. You want to know like really what you're getting
Mm-hmm.
into. Like, what do you stand for? Like, where you stand on all the things that people are like talking about and like debating today, which is a
Mm-hmm.
very interesting place for a company to be.
Yeah.
And we can get into a whole debate about like capitalism and whether it's actually a company's job to be the
Right.
exemplar and solver of those problems. I think in some cases it is and some it isn't, but the main thing is like people just want to know like, can
Mm-hmm.
I work here and like feel good about it, or
Yeah.
am I gonna like wake up and like we're in the middle of some sort of scandal for like reasons that I had not anticipated. And we've seen so many companies like implode a little bit this year
Mm-hmm.
from like scandals around
Right.
like workplace policies, or like diversity issues or representation issues. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I kind of wandered off topic here, but yes, it's a very interesting time to be talking about these things. And what has really worked at Buffer, and I'm very grateful to have walked into a culture that already was doing this,
Mm-hmm.
is just to be like super upfront about
Mm-hmm.
it. And I think it takes a lot to own up to the mistakes and the challenges, as well as to sort of like celebrate the successes. And especially when you are representing the company, there's this sort of like old school PR thing that comes out where you just want to be like, we're everything's
Right.
good, like nothing to see here, like we're fine, we're successful, like don't worry about us. But that's I think like Gen Z
Mm,
folks who are looking for jobs like see right through that. Like we're like, okay, but like we can go on like any number of sites and social media spots and like get the real stories and just own
mhm,
up to it. Just say like what's
mhm,
really going on.
mhm.
So that's been like such a pleasure and like weird fun discovery for me at Buffer, that people loved to read about our mistakes and were so unfailingly like supportive
Mhm.
of us, saying like, here's the ways we messed up and here's how we're going to fix them. And it's not for everybody. You have to have a lot of trust that exists already, or you
Right.
have to start to build and grow that trust through communication. But I think it can be really refreshing, especially
Mhm.
for the younger folks who are sort of like looking for a place that does kind of stand for something
Mhm.
in the world when they look for a job.
Yeah, I think that's interesting, and I think um, I'm like very much oversimplifying this, but thinking about like to create authentic employer branding content, it should maybe be like a little bit scary to post because it's things that people aren't talking about as much. And I think
Yeah. I think that's probably a really good, like being vulnerable is
right.
inherently scary, but being vulnerable is what people respond to. And of course, like I don't think you need to be like, here's all the problems we
Yeah.
have, here's all the ways we need to improve. Like, every company,
Mm.
has that mix of things they're doing well and things they know that they can improve on.
Mhm.
So I think that's, really what you're looking for. You just want to go in eyes wide open. You don't want to be
Yeah.
like fleeced.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Cool. I have one last question.
Okay.
I would love to hear just something you wish you had known sooner about people ops, whether that's something that you didn't know when you first started working in people ops that you know quite clearly now, or something you've learned in the last few months.
Mm, that's such a good one. My initial response is that I wish that I had known people ops existed
Mm,
earlier. I come from a background that's kind of varied, but
mm,
I before I was in startups, I was in a bunch of like old school journalism, newspaper and magazine companies, and then HR was like, you saw them like twice, like once when you filled out your like paperwork
right.
so you could like get paid in the right place, and like the end when you like undid all that so you could like leave and go somewhere else. And there was
Mm,
really no middle. Like
right.
HR, I think, has a reputation of being like people that you don't necessarily want to talk to, and if you are
Mm,
talking to them, something is
right.
wrong or changing in a way that you may or may not be okay with.
Mm-hmm.
So startups have a lot of flaws, and there's a lot we could dissect. But one thing that I think is really great that tech and the startup culture have
Mm,
done is redefine the HR function,
yeah.
and turned it into a much more healthy,
Mm,
holistic way of looking at a team. And I wish that had existed sooner, and
mm,
I wish that I had known about it as soon as it existed, because I could have been like, I could have been doing this a lot longer, because
mm,
it's so fun, and it's so impactful.
mm.
So yeah, probably that.
Yeah. I said last question, but I'm going to sneak one more in
Please
because
do.
it's something I've been thinking about a little bit. And I think you have like an interesting uh, range of experience, having been at Buffer for 7 years, almost 7 years,
7 years.
7 years. And I think that something about people ops work and diversity and inclusion work is that it's kind of a long haul. These projects that you work on take a long time, and you have to like slowly bring everyone along with you and get that buy-in. Um, and it can be really, really rewarding, but it can also sometimes feel like a little bit of a long haul. So I'm curious, I guess, how you sustain people ops work and diversity and inclusion work, and if you're able to find like quick wins in any way that help you kind of like work through that.
That's a great question. And I hope you ask everybody, because I want to hear their suggestions too.
Mm,
This is like the number one issue that I'm facing, and I know a lot of
mm,
people on the teams I've worked with have been facing, like especially in 2020. It really
yeah.
is a time where a lot of people are at risk for burnout,
Mm,
and are maybe like living in burnout and possibly don't know it, because it can
yeah.
manifest in so many different ways.
Mm,
So I have had some success and
yeah.
some that were less successful tactics here. One thing that really helps is just to do calls like this, have
Mm,
conversations like this, where you like sort of broaden your perspective a little bit, and you're not in the sort of like a micro of
right.
every day. You're kind of thinking on a higher level, and you have a chance to connect with other people
Mm,
who are like in the trenches with
mm,
you, so to speak. So that's nice. And a lot of those conversations can also lead you to recall some of your own wins and
mm,
achievements and accomplishments, whether they're singular or like with your team. Um, and if those don't come up frequently enough, I do try and keep like a list of, just like
mm,
stuff I've shipped, stuff I've launched, like,
yeah.
nice things people have said about me.
Yeah.
Like, so when you're having like a really terrible day, you can look at those and be like, okay, I actually like did some stuff, and
Mm,
like people appreciated it. Sometimes that's like all you need to kind of like bring you back.
100%.
Because you're right, it is a long haul, and it can feel like you're like making such glacial progress that you're like,
Hmm.
am I doing anything? Am I like effective at all?
Yeah.
But if you can go back and be like, oh, okay, like I did some things and I'll do things again and people will appreciate them. That helps a lot. And take time off, like, you
Yeah.
know, that one's kind of like obvious, but still very hard to do sometimes.
Yeah.
I think especially if you're in people, you're kind of like the
Mm.
last person to want to take time off. You're like
Yeah.
preaching it to everyone else, but maybe
Mhm.
not doing it. So
Mhm.
it's important to like lead by example and you know, do what you suggest for others also.
Yeah. Cool. I love that. Thanks, Courtney.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
thanks for joining me for today's chat. It was fun getting to catch up with you.